Press play. Data punks, fine wine aficionados, and social thinkers, Jeffrey Colon and Cheryl Metzger are your hosts of Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds.
If it's Friday, it's another episode of Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds. Hey, we got a special treat in store. We're actually broadcasting live on Facebook Live, and we'll give you details on that. But first, Cheryl, say hello.
Hello, everyone. I'm back.
Yeah. What have you been up to the past couple weeks?
I've been traveling. We've been pitching business, doing a lot of reading into what's been changing in the marketplace. So super excited to share some of what we've been finding. Looking forward to talking today.
Well, it's exciting. A lot of people emailed me, a lot of listeners, they tweeted to me or direct messaged me and said, hey, where are you guys? And we love Cheryl, so hopefully you're coming back with her, which, of course, is a fun part of the podcast. I think the most interesting thing, too, is this new setup actually allows us to, people can hear you, because I know you're in Chicago, I'm in Seattle, and I feel almost like we got a little bit of a multimedia, like a ESPN radio broadcast type feel, but I hacked this together on probably nothing, which is the essence of growth hacking, which we'll probably get into a little bit later in the episode. But in the interim, what have you seen on the internets as of lately that has sort of excited you in the marketing or cultural world?
Yeah, well, so I actually, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have seen this as well. This came out about yesterday, 2 days ago, very recently this week. I saw this really interesting story about a poet and activist named Moa Haidar. And she's a Muslim woman who lives in Flint, in the Flint Township in Michigan, which many people are familiar with. And she did such an interesting thing. She released a song pretty organically on the internet. She produced it with another Flint, a local Flint artist. His name was Tunde Olaniran. I'm probably not pronouncing his last name correctly, but he's also an artist and songwriter. They produced this video, and it's such an interesting confluence of different themes. So it's a very sort of feminist, female pride, power type of song. She actually raps in the video. She's also 8 months pregnant. And the theme of the rap, it's pretty powerful. She's 8 months pregnant. She's rapping about hijab. And she's also talking about sort of Muslim women around the world and the sort of the strength that they feel in wearing hijab. And it was just such an interesting thought to me, because here you have both a very strong American identity. You have a very strong female identity. You have a Muslim identity. Yep. You have, someone who also embraces the hijab, and you also have someone who's rapping. And I found it all kind of very idiosyncratic and also pretty transgressive. The idea of, there are some Muslims who are upset by her rapping. There's some that are very excited by it. She's obviously someone who feels religious, but at the same time, she's kind of taking this very unexpected approach to expressing that. I thought it was also interesting to note that the producer of her video, this Flint artist, his album was named Transgressor. And that really seemed to be a kind of shared theme, this idea of like really breaking down definitions, boundaries, expectations. That really caught my eye this week.
That's interesting. I'm curious to know on sort of that theme, if it ties into this larger theme that you and I talk about quite a bit offline or off air, to use sort of an old term, about the fact that it's harder to lump everybody into categories and personas in this day and age, because we are so complex and we're into so many different things. And I almost use the terminology, we're a surfeit of subcultures now. There's just something for almost everyone, no matter what you're into, and we can't really, I guess, put everybody into these mass buckets anymore. Is that obviously that makes the world a lot more beautiful, but is that causing a lot of is that a cause for a lot of I guess not concern, but it's more difficult for marketers, I guess, to navigate, because it's hard to define to define people, I guess, in these like mass equations.
Yeah, I think it's definitely harder. And I also think we're really living in a time where that the very unique identities that each person has, which is increasingly complex, especially as we have a globalized world, people are moving into different parts of the world. They have blends of cultures, blends of races, blends of belief systems. Transgressive is just such a perfect term to me that that's one of the reasons why this video caught so much attention, is because it's really timely for the tensions that exist now. There's so many different things kind of blending, butting heads with each other. People the way this video sort of connects, in my mind, with marketing, like you were just suggesting, is this notion of disruption that's so inherent in it. It's like you have all of these things which historically butted heads that in this one video have been seamlessly blended together into this new hybrid vision. It's like, well, this is a very new vision of what it could mean to be a woman, to be a Muslim, to wear hijab, to be a rapper, to be a pregnant woman. Like even just the motherhood aspect of the video was very unexpected and adds another layer to this identity. So coming back to marketing, I think it's incredibly hard for marketers to have a sense clearly of the multitude of individuals that they are marketing to. And I have heard some chief marketing officers recently really talk about how they need to market to all 10 million of their customers. They're not talking anymore about, they're not marketing to this segment. They're marketing to all of the individual people that exist out there. So it's a huge challenge. And I think just like this video, it really requires breaking down former barriers and kind of recreating a new way of thinking, a sort of hybrid way of thinking, to tap into this kind of trend.
Speaking of a hybrid way of thinking, and maybe some of our listeners heard the news, maybe they didn't. It was pretty much in the trades out there. So Coca-Cola no longer has a chief marketing officer. They now have a chief growth officer, which, of course, if you are working for a technology startup, having the title of chief growth officer or growth officer isn't strange. But now we're talking about a multinational, billion-dollar company or corporation that actually has said, hey, we're not going to have a CMO. We're going to have a CGO, which is a hybrid between a marketing officer and a technology officer. So again, curious to know what you think here in terms of where, this might lead and maybe why Coca-Cola decided to go in this direction.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because when I was looking at some of these headlines as well about this shift, and they talk about how it's a blend of sort of innovation and technology. And I think one of the ways that this changes how marketers need to think is it's really much more about experience. Technology and innovation really point to the experience that you deliver through those things. I think it also, when it comes to innovation, the implication there is a chief growth officer is going to think about processes internally. Like, how do we change the way we do things? How do we make it easier, simpler, more optimized, more efficient? How do we remove barriers? So this new role has both an outward facing view of like, how do I think about the experience that our technology and innovation deliver to the customer, but then also has an internal view of how do we rethink how we do things? How do we get shit done differently so that we can deliver the kind of experience that's going to add value to our customers? So in other words, I think of it as much more of almost like a business consulting, customer experience, innovation design kind of hybrid, which is very different than where some of the traditional CPG executive teams have played. And I thought it was interesting in noting this Coca-Cola announcement that the CMO who's leaving I'm just going to double check the stat here. He had been in his role for over 30 years, I believe.
30 years. Think about that.
Yes. Yes. And I feel like that's, 35-year career with the company. Now that he hasn't been a CMO for 35 years.
Yeah.
But what does that do to a person when they haven't had to be disrupted in their own career? They haven't had to market other types of services or products. They haven't had to target a different audience. When you've only stayed in that single path for so long, I think it does handicap you to take that kind of dual perspective that I just mentioned. It's hard to look internally at reshaping processes, and it's hard to think about the experience you deliver your customers when you've sort of been used to doing things a certain way for such a long period of time.
And you bring up used to doing things the same way for a long period of time. I think that's why, and I talk to a lot of recruiters, and they'll say things are swinging away from how they had operated for a long period of time. It used to be that if you jumped around quite a bit, that was looked at as, hey, this is not, this person isn't committed to working in one position. But what recruiters are actually saying now is, wait, what's the context of why that person jumped around? Because they could do some really amazing work, and then they want to be challenged next to do some things. So we almost have two personalities, and of course we have way more than two, but I'm just using this as an analogy, where you have people who are very good at sustainable innovation, so they're able to work in a role and make things happen incrementally. And then you have people who are very good at recreating things. And once they've recreated it, they're not challenged anymore. So they want to go on and recreate the next thing for their career or for a company, et cetera. So it's almost important for, I think, recruiters now when they look at marketers to realize, hey, it's time to look at things a little bit different from how we've looked at, recruiting people in the past. That, maybe being in a position for 1 or 2 years isn't a bad thing if that person explains what they did while they're there. And we also know that you can do a lot of stuff in a matter of months now in some of these positions. You don't have to, it doesn't take years or decades like it did, in sort of the analog era.
Well, I mean, I think it depends too, because if you're dealing with a massive global infrastructure, even something as simple as packaging change, which can have a really big impact on sales, that takes at least a year to get packaging to be changed. So, there are certain processes that just from the mechanics of them take a really long time. But to your point about hiring and, the shift towards chief growth officers, there's this great stat in one of the articles I saw. It's from some research by Accenture, and they said that 50% of CEOs see a CMO as the primary driver of disruptive growth, but 37% would put the marketing CMO first on the firing line if that's not achieved. So the expectation is that the CMO now is going to drive disruptive growth, and the pressure is so high that if they don't deliver that, they're first on the chopping block. And I thought that was a really interesting stat because it shows how now disruptive growth started in those startups like you're talking about, where it was safe to take risks, and that was the nature of an entrepreneurial business. But what I think is really interesting about that stat is what it's saying is now at a corporate, global CPG level, they need people that take risks, and they need people. It kind of comes back to that word transgressive. They need someone who, instead of in the past, they needed someone who was going to stay 35 years, someone who was going to be safe and reliable and protect the business. And now what they need is someone who's going to challenge the business, and someone who's going to, disrupt the system, and someone who's going to take risks, and someone who's not going to be safe. And I think someone who's not going to be safe is likely to be the person that moves from company to company or different experiences, but has to do so thoughtfully. And what I mean by that is it can be a mark of someone who's not able to be successful if they're constantly jumping companies in similar roles because maybe they don't get along well with people, or maybe they aren't able to communicate or inspire. Now, someone who jumps from company to company, though, and actually has very different types of roles in those companies, or works in very different types of companies in a similar type of role, that's someone who can be transgressive. That's someone who can, challenge the system and adapt quickly and kind of become this hybrid, because what they're doing is collecting experiences and they're collecting new ways of thinking. And they're bringing that with them as they move along. So it's interesting now that to sort of summarize, the CMOs of the past were the people who were the safe protectors of the business, who kind of had to keep, it's all about reducing risk and maintaining, protecting the growth that companies kind of expected to have. Now it's about kind of throwing out those rules and really focusing on change and not being safe anymore.
Yeah, and it was the Wall Street Journal that said that I guess the tenure of a CMO now is 36 months. Think about that. 3 years you're in a position, which is almost how a lot of people jump around from position to position anyhow. They probably stay about 3.5 years before they go somewhere else. But they're almost forced now because, as you stated, they are required, or many CEOs look at a CMO to drive growth. So it isn't a matter of protecting the business as much as, hey, you have to drive growth. And if you can't do that, then we'll find someone who can. And a lot of the modern day CMOs, I think, are having trouble navigating that because they haven't grown up in a world where they had to be technical. Right. It was much more around storytelling or the creative work. And now it's a matter of a combination of all these different skill sets. Can you listen to the customer? Can you put that into a feedback loop? Do you understand marketing technology? Can you work with your IT department to figure these things out? And then also, what does it mean when you measure a lot of things? You and I can probably take up an entire podcast and talk about how, what does it mean? What do a lot of these metrics mean? And I think a lot of people are actually questioning that. I mean, JP Morgan just did a test recently where they realized they ran a lot less digital advertising and still had the same effect. Mm-hmm. And that's going to really, I think, be interesting in terms of where the world, pivots there. But that leads me to sort of my next topic of discussion, if CMOs have to pivot to be chief growth officers, content marketing is going to be such a big instrument that they use. What's the problem there? Because I can't tell. I gotta have you comment on this first, because I almost get flustered and frustrated about this topic because I've been to so many conferences lately, and it just. I feel like people are trying to simplify something that's just much more difficult to navigate.
Yeah, well, I would take a couple steps back because I think one of the things I thought was interesting that does end up having implications for content, to the point of this Coca-Cola shift, there was a great quote that said, as long as marketers continue to position themselves as experts in advertising, brand positioning, millennials, and the latest digital fads, instead of being growth drivers, we'll see more CMO positions disappear. Yes. And what I think is really telling about that is when you go back to being a protector of the business, what that really means is the business can run without you. You just need to provide air cover. That's the role marketers have had for a long time. It's like you provide the advertising, you do the brand positioning, but the business of the business is handled by other people. That's right. Handled by the supply chain. That's handled by the inventory. That's handled by sales. That's handled by finance. You don't touch that. And so marketers have been very peripheral to the actual engineering of the business. Whereas a chief growth officer has to think much more like a consultant, where they have to really look at how the business operates and what are all of the different elements of the business. How do they work together in concert to create an experience for the customer? That's a much more operational, technical, much more hands-on role into the business, which is why I think a chief growth officer role is a much more valuable one, and marketers should aspire to really be thinking about how the business is engineered and how the output experience is engineered. And so to that point, when you look at marketers right now, you and I had talked before we were on the podcast about how there's only so much innovation that can manage for a product that hasn't changed.
Yep.
So like when your product is the same product it was 100 years ago, there's only so much innovation that can happen to really drive growth. There's a certain limit to what you can do there. And so that got me thinking about, B2B companies and other companies that have a certain product that maybe hasn't changed that much. So when it comes to the discussion around like content, I think content marketing needs to change in the same way that the role of the marketer has changed. So the role of the marketer used to be very surface level. You tell the brand story, you do the advertising.
Yeah.
Now it has to be much more about like shaping the business. So similarly, I think the days of content being used to tell a story, to deliver a message, it's not that that's necessarily gone, but I don't think that kind of content is actually effective. And if you're being a chief growth officer of content, I think what people need to really think about is content that actually drives decision making. And so there's actually a really great report I would recommend to all of our listeners. Check it out. It's a 2017 Trust Radius buyer vendor report. And what it looks at is specifically in the technology sort of B2B space, but I think this is relevant for anyone in content marketing. It looks at the gap of trust that exists between the buyers and the vendors. And one of the things that it talks about is vendors are off producing content that's really easy for them to produce. Like it's cheap, it's fast, it doesn't take as much energy,
it's cheap, fast, and good, right?
Exactly, right. One of those things is missing.
Yes.
And that's what they're finding. They're creating content because they can, but they know it's not actually proving to be very effective.
Yeah.
Similarly, we're seeing the buyers consuming a lot of content, and that's usually where a lot of content marketing stats stop. They'll say like, oh, well, your buyer's consuming 12 pieces of content. What they're not saying is the next stat, which the Trust Radius report cites, which is though a lot of content is consumed, most of it is not trusted. Yeah. And most of it is not helpful. So at the end of the day, what I started looking at in this research is, well, what is the content that actually is helpful in terms of getting a buyer to make a decision? And what they found was that it's all the kinds of content that really gives you sets expectations for your experience with the people and products behind the company. So a demo that uses my data, information that's customized to my business, being able to have like a hands-on experience or talk directly to a sales rep, having an on-site experience with a sales rep, things where the buyer can have in-person interactions with your people or hands-on experiences with your products. Those are the most influential experiences. And so the most influential content is a proxy for those experiences. The content that gives you a clear demo of the product, that sets your expectations for how you're going to be treated by the company, that gives you a view into what kinds of people work at that company, that shares with you what your customer service experience might look like and feel like. How does the company resolve issues if they arise? What is the experience going to be like when you're actually handling and working with the product, as opposed to the current sort of marketing content, which is selling you the product,
but
not actually showing you what it's going to be like when you're working with it.
Yes.
To me, I feel like it's all about, at a CMO level, getting hands-on into the business. And at a content level, it's really giving your customers sort of the experience of what that hands-on interaction with the people and products is going to be like.
It almost reminds me that, some chief growth officers, if more companies move this direction, and I think they will, that's one of the things I talked about in my book, but I think they will move this direction, have to actually be practitioners with whatever it is they're trying to sell. So that may even change, where in the past you may have had a person that, let's say, they marketed fashion. They worked for a fashion brand. That best marketer actually could be someone who's a designer, who work, who design, because they actually understand the aesthetics of what goes into making the clothes, the feeling behind it, etc. You could see some hybrid growth or different moves in some of these areas, only because it requires a deeper understanding of what you're trying to do, especially in the technical world, especially in the B2B world, as you noted. I think the only area it might be a little bit different is fast moving consumer goods, because it's just a totally different aesthetic altogether. But I think in most areas, like even if you work in hospitality, I think you have to be a person who understands, how that industry has changed, why people buy into experiences, how they book travel, why they book travel, what they book it on, what devices do they use, how they document it when they get to a particular location. That's very, very important now. In the past, as you noted, Cheryl, you just had to basically say, how do you get someone on board so they buy something and then forget it? We're good.
Right.
Now you almost have to really understand everything, and then actually how people loop back through. And that changes, of course, over time, depending on who your audience is. There's less loyalty that exists now. A lot of things, I think that the skill set of the discipline is just much more complex than it had been made out to be for, probably from like the 50s till the last, until 2000, let's say 10. I think there was a big shift there, and I think that's probably why we're seeing so much erosion. It almost reminds me of some of these other lines of business that have gone through this type of disruption in the past, the publishing industry, the music industry, et cetera, where they just had to dismantle who was in charge because they just didn't have the skill sets required to really, adapt to the new normal.
Yeah, and it brings up another sort of thought that kind of connects back to the beginning of our conversation, and that's the role of artists that I think corporations should really start considering. So the reason I mentioned that is I know some big agencies that, obviously agencies have traded in having a creative team for a long time. You go to the agency for the creative. But what was interesting is now I'm seeing some big agencies actually reach out into artist communities, they're trying to find those young millennial artists, or actually younger than millennials. I flatter myself to consider millennials young anymore.
The oldest millennials are now like 37, so we can't use that term.
Let's not talk about age. But the point is, they're going out to find those young people that are creating music, that are writing poetry, that are that are photographers, that are telling stories, that are using Snapchat, that are just like out there using all of these new media for ways of expressing themselves and engaging audiences. Yep. That type of creativity that's just so natural to younger people, that blends a natural sensitivity sensibility for engaging an audience, a creative artistic mindset and creative artistic output, and then this use of old school technology and modern technology. So old school technology being something as simple as writing, by hand, or delivering, for instance, like spoken word poetry, versus Snapchat. The people who seamlessly blend all of those together, those are the people that will help to disrupt agencies and marketing teams. And I think corporate culture would do themselves a favor to follow suit and to bring artists and to bring musicians and to bring those transgressive people, the people who challenge the status quo, the people who, blend things that haven't been blended before, the people who see things that haven't been seen before, or who, provoke by their nature, or who take risks by their nature. That's what these companies need, not in every single role, but certainly in, when these leaders are trying to really shape a new vision for leadership, they would do well to be influenced by those people.
And it's funny because I think we'll end on that note by also noting, for those who are listening, we are doing what Cheryl is stated right now, because we normally record this podcast and then we post edit it and then we post it. but we actually now are live streaming it through video. People can hear you, Cheryl, which is pretty awesome. So it almost takes the old feel of like an old radio show of people calling. You're remote, but people can hear you, and they can see me. And then ultimately we'll be able to switch that where they'll be able to see you and hear me.
No one wants that.
Oh, come on.
No one wants that.
And, that's like a blending of the two worlds and how you actually, how you sort of, I guess, manipulate media. And I think that's what we need a little bit more in that, in this world. Instead of being safe, how do you use media to really advance your message?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where can we find you on Twitter for our listeners?
You can always find me at The Real Cheryl M, and that's Cheryl with a C.
And I'm at DJGEOFFE. You can also follow us at Disruptive FM. I'm Jeffrey Colon.
And I'm Cheryl Metzger.
And we'll catch you next time.
You've been listening to an episode of Disruptive FM, the marketing podcast for eccentric minds. Rate and review the show on iTunes. Purchase a copy of Jeffrey's book, Disruptive Marketing, and follow us on Twitter at Disruptive FM. Signing off from the cities of Chicago and Seattle, press pause.